While Carol's passing that, good morning. I think everybody knows me. My name's Ed Wheeler. Pastor Don is on vacation, and I asked to fill in. I do echo what Elder Rowan said last week or a couple weeks ago in his introduction. I'm not trained, so forgive whatever doesn't flow, and please do come back when Pastor Don is here. Just recognize that I'm not the regular pastor, and we'll go on from there. Let's start by asking for God's presence during this. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time to be here. I pray that you'll watch over me as in this moment I try to expound on your word, dear Lord. Your word sharing, dear Lord, how faith should guide us. I humbly ask that you take this message and use it to glorify your name, dear Lord. May the words I speak be filled with your Spirit, the focus on you and not me. Please let your truth, dear Lord, come out so that those listening may gain a deeper understanding of your will. May your people leave this gathering with a renewed sense of promises that they have in you. In Jesus' name, amen. A trained pastor normally has 3 points. Pastor Don sticks to that pretty good. I struggle to be a renegade. Most of you know that about me, so I really wanted to put in 4 points. But I only came up with 3. So the message, if you didn't figure it out from the title, Things Unseen. No, I wasn't saving up a Halloween message. I don't have any ghosts and ghouls and goblins for you. I think most of you recognize from the title that it's from Hebrews, and it regards faith. Probably should have put this first. But Pastor Don likes you to stand while we read it. I didn't look up the page number, but I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to trust that you're going to... Okay, good. I'm going to trust that you're going to make an effort to stay awake, but I think Don wants to emphasize the scripture portion. So if we can read these 3 together. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for the evidence of things not seen. By it, the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. Thank you. I did give a message back in July. If you heard that and you actually paid attention, I was giving one today and you're still here. Thank you. I pointed out my only references for being up here giving a messages. The main one is I've been on the missions board for 22 years now, and I pointed out at the time that I don't even think I'm a bench warmer as far as lining up people to cover Pastor Don while he's gone. And in the message I gave, I said sometimes we need to encourage ourselves to do something, and this is fun, this is fun, this is fun. But this time, I asked to come back by my own request. Though many were graceful when I last spoke, thank you, Annie, I had no intention of speaking again for maybe another 15 years or so. But I do believe that sometimes in life, God speaks to us. We can choose to listen and obey, or we can pretend we didn't hear him. And from my experiences, listening and obeying results in a far better outcome. So leading up to this message, missions at OBC is funded, as most of you know, by Faith Promise. We support 20 missionaries and organizations. It's called Faith Promise for a reason. And leading up to the conference, I was asked how well the missions board thought that we did explaining the faith part of Faith Promise. Initially, I felt that we'd done a pretty good job. We try to include it in our missions moments, the letter that goes out before the conference. I tended to feel that, we did point out the faith part of Faith Promise. But then when I thought about it, I asked myself, do we really point that out, or do we just say it? Later, I was reminded by somebody that during our 29th years of Faith Promise, that sometimes people came up and gave an example of how the amount that they chose ended up being something which God provided almost exactly, such as in that example, it was a tax law change that provided almost exactly the amount of money that they'd promised on Faith Promise the year before, or earlier in the year. We were emphasizing that faith is part of that promise. As cards were being collected, a new member came up to me and said, I don't really know how much to give. I pointed out that we have these booklets downstairs in the foyer, and it explains some of Faith Promise and why, and a little bit of topic on how much, but I didn't go into it any more than that. So I asked myself later, do I really consider each time I do that card what God is telling me to do? Or do I just take that card like I did the year before and the year before that, and I just fill it out? Was I letting my own familiarity with Faith Promise prevent me from actually approaching it the way it was intended? Determining how much to give, or determining what we do, whether it's something that we do all the time, or it's the first time. We need to consider what God is telling us to do. Was I complacent in my own familiarity? Was I trusting God? When God speaks to us directly, sometimes it's hard to know whether the answer we think we're hearing is something that we want to hear or something that God is really telling us. In my years in the Navy, when commiserating with others, it was often said that Navy stood for never again volunteer yourself. And while I think that's still true, perhaps in the example of Christmas games that are played, there are times when volunteering yourself is honoring God. So when I told Pastor Don back in July, it was very unlikely that I would speak here again, that my biggest issue with speaking was actually getting a topic. I had speech in high school, and getting a topic, I spent more time sometimes getting a topic than I did on what I ended up doing. But when God gives you a topic, you don't have that problem. I sometimes wonder if what a pastor chooses to preach on, I say message, I'm not preaching today, I'm giving a message, that if what God gives us, or what God gives him, isn't meant for him. Maybe the message is meant for the person that receives the message. But maybe very often it applies to somebody else that hears it. So faith is a gift. Don likes to toss in a little Latin. I don't want him to show me up too much, but after all, he is trained. But faith, the Greek word, is pistis. And scholars are often debating about something. I guess that's all they have to do in the academia world. But it's generally agreed upon that faith in Jesus is at the core of the Christian tradition. Faith is required to be a Christian. We can't see it. We can't touch it. How can we understand it? Well, theologians like to break it up into describing it that one group says faith is loyalty and commitment to Him and His teachings. Another group says it's belief, trust, and reliance. I'm not sure that they're not all true. I don't see a conflict there. Of course, theologians need something to theologize. Hebrews was directed to Jewish Christians who were facing persecution for their beliefs. Hebrews 11 is often referred to as the Faith Hall of Fame. The Bible has over 350 references to faith, but when you're counting them, you should probably keep in mind that 10% of those are in that one book alone. There are names of individuals that throughout the Old Testament exhibited faith, even though at times they didn't know that that's what they were doing. Verse 1 seems to be a good definition of faith by itself. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Things that we hope for, but things that we cannot see. In verse 2, for it is the elders, for by it being faith, the elders obtained a good testimony. It's a short verse, but it's important, as all verses are. A good testimony is also translated as having God's approval. It was a choice to follow God with confidence, even though we know what lies ahead, or don't know what lies ahead. The famous figures listed later throughout that chapter are among the people of old who are commended on the basis of their faith. Verse 3, by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. Verse 3 is about putting our trust in God, based on the parts we can see, the world around us. This helps us rely on Him for the things that we can't see. Hebrews is often said to be a book that asks us to look for evidence. We may not be able to fully understand how God started with nothing and created the universe. Genesis 1 tries to keep it in simple terms. Science tries to explain it, but we know it doesn't come close. But we can't dispute what does exist. Through His creation, God has made the invisible visible. Because of the things we cannot see, we have foundation. Because of the things we can see, we have foundation on the things we cannot. The rest of this chapter gives us more examples of faith of prominent people in the Old Testament. In some cases, their faith was obvious. While in others, at least to me, it wasn't very clear about what they were being commended about actually involved faith. I'm going to go to verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it, he being dead still speaks. If we look at, I didn't include that, but if we look at the Genesis version, Genesis 4, starting in verse 2, it says, now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the earth. In the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but He did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. We know that Cain eventually ended up killing his brother Abel out of jealousy. It's actually the Hebrews 11, verse 4, that gives context, to me at least. God did not accept Cain's offering of fruit, but he accepted Abel's offering of the sacrifice of a carefully chosen firstborn of his flock. Was God discerning what they gave? Was there a difference between the fruit and the meat? Hebrews 11:4 tells us that it was Abel's faith that caused his sacrifice to be accepted by God, and not so much about what was sacrificed or given. Next verse, 5. Whoops, I already did that. In Enoch's example, to me at least, it's a little easier to understand the faith. Verse 5, by faith, Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death, and was not found, because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. In Enoch's time, Genesis 6, 5 through 12, just before the flood, tells us that almost every living person had rejected God. The world was corrupt and full of violence. But Enoch refused to be silent about the sinfulness around him. And in verse 24, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Enoch and Elijah are two examples of people who never died on earth. God took them up before. Some theologians think that there's a special purpose for them later. These two examples were before the flood. And verse 6 sort of summarizes at that point, even though there's many, many more examples listed. But without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So through faith, we believe in God. Through it, we please him, and he will reward us. Faith is a gift of God. This is better summed up in Ephesians 2, 8 and 9. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any should boast. This one verse has pretty much the most important parts in the Bible all rolled together. It's probably got everything in it that I'm going to say, so maybe I should have just started with that and let you go, but no. Grace, faith, and salvation. Grace is God giving us what we don't deserve. Faith, trust, belief, and reliance in him. Salvation is being reconciled with God through faith in Jesus Christ, saved from the penalties of sin. Sin is a spiritual death. It's a separation from God. Faith is measurable. In Romans 12:3, we read, God gives each of us a measure of faith. It's not always the same amount. For I say through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. Jesus used many examples of faith in the New Testament. There's many stories of him healing people. His disciples, at one point, though, were concerned about their faith, or admonished about it. In Mark 4:40, when they left the multitude and Jesus was going across to rest, he fell asleep in the boat. And when the wind arose, they woke Jesus, and he rebuked the wind and said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" I had two on the same slide. Yeah, Matthew 14, 31 and 32. Peter was planning to walk on the water, as Jesus was doing. The wind scared him, and he floundered. And immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him, and said to him, "O ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. So even with the disciples, we have a case of no faith, little faith. They lived with Jesus every day. They saw what Jesus did, and they still struggled. Matthew 8:10 refers to a centurion who asked Jesus to heal a servant. The servant wasn't present, but the centurion said, "I don't need for you to go to my house. I believe that you can heal him." When Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to those who followed, "Assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel." So here's a Gentile that Jesus says exhibited great faith. In Matthew 15:28, another example, a woman came to Jesus and asked him to cast out demons in her daughter. And after he did, then Jesus answered and said to her, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire." And her daughter was healed from that very hour. So here's two examples of Gentiles having great faith. Faith is a choice. It can be a difficult concept. In Matthew 17, the disciples could not understand why they could not cast out a demon when they were approached when Jesus was not there. So Jesus said to them, "Because of your unbelief, for assuredly I say to you, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here and to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible to you." The mustard seed that we think of is extremely small. But when we plant it, it can be an herb that grows several feet high. But later on, in a parable of the mustard seed in Matthew 13, 31, and 32, is described as the least of seeds. But when it is grown, it is greater than the herbs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. So from this description, instead of a mustard seed, it sounds like the mustard tree that he's referring to. Salvadora persica. It's also called the toothbrush tree because those in that area used its branches and twigs to make toothbrushes. It's a small evergreen tree. It's native to the Middle East and Africa, and it can grow up to 20 feet high. So regardless of whether he was talking about an herb or the mustard tree, God is telling his disciples that a little faith can accomplish much. If we ask Google AI now is the big thing. Where I work, we're putting a lot of our resources on it, and the big companies are buying a lot of our stuff. But I asked Google AI what would happen if we could move mountains. And it came back and said, it would drastically alter the landscape of the earth, impacting everything from climate patterns to human settlements, potentially creating new coastlines, changing river flows, opening up a vast new area for habitation, but also causing massive disruptions like earthquakes, tsunamis, and ecological devastation, depending on the scale and the location of the mountain movement. Now, I do get accused sometimes for run-on sentence, but I think Google AI has me beat there. But it does sound messy. A mountain, however, need not be geophysical. I don't think that God was necessarily saying to just pick up mountains for no reason and toss them around just because we can. A mountain could be anything that threatens our belief in God. If it threatens our joy, our peace, or our hope. We don't use faith to move mountain ranges, but faith can help us get past the mountains in our lives. It can help us do extraordinary things. When we refer to mountains as life's challenges, we're reminded that faith does not make a sick person well or a poor person rich. God tells us that He will provide what we need and not what we want. Matthew 6:25-34 is a well-known passage about not worrying. In 25 it says, "Therefore, I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing?" Philippians 4:6 tells us, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayerful and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." Worry is the opposite of faith. Romans 14:23 tells us, "But he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because he does not eat from faith. For whatever is not from faith is a sin." For the Christian, excessive worry can be a sin. It demonstrates our lack of faith in God. God, who gives us the richness of His constant, abiding presence. Sometimes God has a plan for us that tests us. Sometimes it involves pain. Sometimes we get ourselves in trouble because we try to solve a problem on our own. Some things in our life may be in our ability to handle, but many things are not. But turning over to God and having faith is not easy. Faith is a discipline. We could have been brought up in many different environments. Maybe we were brought up in church. We always had plenty. Went to school, got good jobs, had very little strife and few challenges. But even then, we have trials and hardships. Others might have grown up with very little, been introduced to God late in life, constantly seem to struggle with things that become to them trials and hardships. I'm sure sometimes when we are facing challenges and we're told to turn it over to God, we might think the person offering that comfort can't really relate to what we're going through. They haven't faced what we had to face. Maybe not exactly, but we all face hardships and challenges. I believe some mistakenly use 1 Corinthians 10:13 to believe that God doesn't give us more than we can handle. Actually, it's in regard to temptations, not necessarily life's burdens. No temptation is overtaking you except such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond and what you're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. When I look at stories in the Bible, I think I could have never survived like Job did. I don't think that I would have had the faith that he had when he went through his trials. The more difficult things are, the more we need to turn it over to God. Even those who appear strongest in their belief in God faltered. Let's look at Elijah, the other one who was a well-known prophet who God chose to take away without dying on the earth. He called down fire from heaven. He spoke words that caused it to not rain for 3.5 years. Yet after all these things, Elijah went into the wilderness downcast and depressed and asked God to kill him. Or David, he killed the lion, the bear, Goliath. He became a king. Yet in several Psalms, he is filled with despair. Oops, I included that. I do 2 on one slide, I guess. I need to pay attention. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? At least in David's case, he was showing some faith by calling to God to help him. I debated and revised some illustrations to include. I think it's hard to say how much God convicted me that I needed to review my faith without including a few of them. I did share at sunrise service and with some that my 2 sisters and I had a challenging childhood. It's a week after Christmas, so I'm just going to use the words challenging, and I won't go any further with that. Until I was 11, I grew up in a 4-room house with my parents and 2 sisters in Indiana. Though we lived in town, we didn't have a bathroom. We had an outhouse about 100 feet behind the house. We had no hot water unless we heated it on the cooking stove or the wood stove in the winter. We had no vehicle until I was 10. With his own difficult upbringing, my dad was on his own at a very young age. His aunts will say that they couldn't contain him from the age of 6, that he was always off and away. My mom quit going from the coal mines area of eastern Kentucky, quit going to school in 8th grade to take care of her 6 siblings, brothers and sisters, when her mother was not able. But there was some frugalness in our house, but despite the low wage jobs, we always had what we needed. We had the vegetable garden, one of the only ones I know of in town, and the neighbors, they didn't hesitate taking our excess when it was offered. The best thing that happened was when our neighbor next door invited us to church. My father encouraged us to go. He did not. But after that, it led to our next phase in life, where we moved to the country. We're in a new school district. Some of the things that we'd gone through in town, we got a fresh start. A bigger house, we had running water until the well broke. So we would draw water from the well every day, and we used the outhouse in the back. On Easter Sunday, when I was 13, it all came to a head. I went to the church service, and I listened to the message, and I accepted God into my heart. Unless you've been there, it's hard to describe what broken means. Things weren't instantly perfect, but I didn't have to deal with it myself. It's much easier to put your faith in God when you have nowhere else to put it. If you're broken, though, and you don't know God, it's even more heartbreaking. While many of my teachers expected that I'd go to college, I had taken college-level courses, cum laude with a 3.77. My parents had no concept of someone from either of their families going to college. I'd enjoyed the school newspaper in high school. I liked doing the features where I interviewed people, a teacher feature, a student feature. But I stuttered so bad that a career in journalism was obviously not going to happen. I did learn in speech class, if you have a speech impediment and you're choosing your favorite author's poems, not to start with, Clorinda met me on the way. I did have some money from summer jobs and digging ginseng. And I probably could have went to a community college. But my parents thought I was all set when they got me a job in the furniture factory where my mom worked. I'd be set for life, as long as it stayed open. Fast forward, it didn't. If not for God and my leaning on Him in faith, I don't know why a Midwestern boy who had never seen the ocean and couldn't swim would join the Navy. But God knew where I needed to be and how to get to my future wife, who was on a dairy farm here in Massachusetts. I turned it over to God, and since then, He's greatly rewarded me. Turning something over to God, be it big or small in the scheme of things, can bring a peacefulness. I'd started out with 2 examples from my Navy days that I had, and I struggled with that. Last night, as I was trying to go to sleep, I decided that they weren't really representing what I thought God wanted me to represent in those examples. So I decided this morning I would pull them out, and I had 2 others that I felt were more appropriate. And as I drifted off to sleep, I could swear that I heard Sally snoring to the tune "It As Well." So I knew that that was the right choice to do. And yes, I am going to pay for that. When I went to a short-term missions trip to Papua New Guinea, it was a long trip in travel and duration. It was all of my vacation for the year. I felt I was being led to spend the 3 weeks working on the New Tribes Missions compound, even though my skill set, my tools and repairs was very limited. There were 14 of us, 13 from the U.S. and 1 from England. The trip was led by David Hill, a Faith Promise supported missionary. The biggest task was re-roofing a large maintenance shed, but there were other smaller tasks lined up. There were about 40 students there, teachers and administrators, and they were being taught how to deal in a remote area where New Tribes works a lot, sending couples into isolated tribes. Due to isolation, there were large water tanks. There were about 10. I don't know how many gallons that they held. But the well below pumped the water up to them, and there was plenty of water even if the power of the generator had a problem. One day it was noticed that 8 of the tanks were empty. The pump in the well was apparently broken. Showers and water use were banned. 5 of our group, not that we were any brawny or hefty, but 5 of our strongest went down to pull the pump. We didn't know how deep it was, but we knew that we had to pull it and the hose and the electrical all at the same time and not break anything. I'd done it a few times at home with Sally's dad's help and other relatives. We'd pulled it out several hundred feet when it stuck. We tugged, we pulled. It wouldn't come up. If we broke the lines, we'd really have a tough time trying to fix the well and restore the water. Our maintenance lead decided to go get the backhoe, that he could use it to lift with more force and he could lift straight up. I went over by the line that we'd been pulling. The others had stood back. I began to pray, ask God to help us with this. I waited a few minutes. I stood up. I grabbed the hose and line, and it started coming up. The others saw that, and they came over. And by the time the backhoe came over, the pump was out. I was tasked. They felt that maybe I knew something about changing a pump to go to the main base and get the spare. The spare was a 3-phase motor. You don't need to know much about electrical other than it wasn't quite compatible with the system that was there. That 14th person that God had sent from England was a master electrician. God had everything planned. When we got the water running, we heard it going back in the tanks. I didn't ask permission. I decided the water ban for the showers had been lifted, and I went and got the first shower. Later on, a few days later, when they checked back in the States with previous administrators, they asked, well, why didn't you just grab the pump and motor from the second well? This was their 3rd well that they left there. It should have been working fine. Nobody knew it was there. Later that week, I was asked to go to the kitchen The large double sink was clogged. The main maintenance guy got it to clear a few times, but it kept clogging, and it was flowing slightly. So I thought, well, recalling my heat transfer and fluid flow from my Navy nuclear power days that I pretty much almost flunked, that maybe some static pressure would help. So we filled both the sinks. And as they started getting fuller and fuller, I started worrying that I wasn't going to look too smart when we had to bail that water out of those sinks when it didn't do anything. So I walked over to the sink. I asked some of the students around me to help, and we prayed that God would free that sink and unplug it. Before we'd finish, the water was gurgling down the drains on both sides. We put some hot water in a pan and we flushed it to make sure that there was no grease in there. I didn't lift the pump. I didn't clear the drain. God did. But we asked. And in Don's message recently, he talked about praying unceasingly. So I find that sometimes when I'm a little overwhelmed, that it's time to ask God. Whether it's your lost keys or your lost remote to your TV, Tana, that sometimes we should just stop and give it to Him. It doesn't always work, but I find it calms me and it resets me. And sometimes it clears my head on what I need to do next. We also hear about faith like a child. Matthew 18:3-4 says, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Now, this isn't about children being sinless, innocent, or noble. It's about those who would be saved must humble themselves to receive God's blessings, to receive God in their heart. We need to be completely dependent on God to provide what we need. Only with this kind of honest humility and dependence on God can anyone come into His kingdom. My mom was the best example of childlike faith that I've ever seen. Before she met my father, she did attend church. She was 26 when she met him, and she'd gone to Indiana and followed her brothers to work in the factory there. My dad went through lengthy health issues. And when he was on hospice, he told my mom, as long as you don't get sick, there should be enough money. The house was paid for. We had no debts. Unfortunately, at that point, my mom already had a lump on her breast that she'd been ignoring while she took care of Dad. Despite the health issues that developed, she went back to church. She flew on an airplane for the first time all the way to Germany to see my sister. She came to live with us here in Massachusetts in her last few months, and she always had a smile. Never a bad word for anybody. I said that she was channeling Bambi's mother because she would say, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. This doesn't mean that she couldn't become irritated at times, but when she got upset with someone, her other motto was, if necessary, bite your tongue until it bleeds. When my father passed away, he had no family left. He pushed my mom's family away. He prepaid their funerals, and he asked not to be embalmed, which meant he had to be buried in 24 hours. He didn't allow anyone there except one neighbor. My younger sister didn't make it home in time from Germany, so there were 10 people counting my kids. When Mom passed away a few years later, the same room at the funeral home was full of her families and church friends. I stood up and I apologized to the family that they were not invited to God's funeral, but we honored his wishes. And then I explained that we weren't having a funeral for my mom. We were having a celebration. I think to Joe, and know that you'll feel the same way. I did share the salvation message, as she asked. How different it is when you pass with others who know of your faith and who share in it. If we have faith and are saved, then despite all the trials in life, we can have a celebration going forward to be with God. Giving it to God, being broken, faith of a child, it's a lot to unpack. Faith should be something that we live and do every day. My introduction included faith promise as a reason for giving this message. Had I really explained faith promise in my letters and missions moments? The Great Commission is a mandate. God's chosen instrument is a local church. When we take a collection, we refer to it as our tithes and our offerings. Are they the same? A tithe is given straight off the top of what we have. In the Old Testament, the amount was specifically defined as a tenth, but it could be livestock, crops, or money. In the New Testament, God never commanded a tithing, but he did commend it. An offering was additional and used for other purposes, such as the repairs that we've talked about on the church. In this case, it was to meet the needs and operations of the local church. Faith promise is an example of an offering, not in place of a tithe, but in addition to. Besides helping traveling missionaries, Paul felt the churches should also aid the Judeans who were facing famine and persecution and high taxes. A farmer who sows his seeds exercises faith that there will be a crop after, there will be rain and sunshine and harvest. A farmer might also promise a calf that wasn't born yet, that it would live, and he would donate its proceeds. 2 Corinthians 9:7 says, "So let each one give as he proposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver." C.S. Lewis is often quoted as saying, "I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I'm afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare." He goes on to say that if we're comfortable in our lifestyle, we're probably not giving enough. I will say, though, that there are people in life who do not have the basics. If you don't have food, you don't have electricity, you don't have heat, then we do need to worry about that before we decide what's extra and what we don't have. No one here at AOBC is going to tell someone how much to give. We're not going to judge, whether it be a tithe, an offering, or a faith promise. We can give it regularly as part of a budget. We can give up something that we don't need. Or we can step out completely in faith. But we do need to recognize if we step out completely in faith and we receive something, that God provided it. When asked what my ideal job would be, I usually say a philanthropist. Of course, you need a lot of money to be a philanthropist, or somebody else's to give away. Dave Ramsey has said, "Giving encourages a grateful and generous spirit and can help steer us away from the greed and discontent." He adds, "I always say that being outrageously generous is the most fun you'll ever have with money." Giving can be fun. It doesn't matter how much or how little, as long as you use what God gave you. Even if all you have is a smile or a welcoming embrace, all that matters is that we use that to glorify God. Last time I gave a message, I picked out some hymns, but I realized Carol's much better at doing that than I am. Growing up, I also learned that hymns are a great source to help others. It was also how Sally knew that I wasn't pretending to be a Christian. Carol chose "My Faith Has Found a Resting Place," which was written by Eliza Hewart around 1891. Hewart was born on June 28, 1858 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Upon graduation, she became a teacher. But shortly thereafter, she suffered a severe, serious spinal cord problem when a student hit her with a heavy slate. She was an invalid for the remainder of her life, even though she was able to partially recover. Yet she still wrote a famous hymn. Some other faith-based hymns have similar stories. "Faith is the Victory" was written by John Henry Yates in 1882. In 1878, there was a diphtheria outbreak, and his wife and children died. Horatio Gates Bamford wrote "All Is Well," which you sang a few verses of this morning. He'd sent his wife and his 4 daughters to England ahead while he worked on some issues after the Great Fire in Chicago. On the way crossing, the steamship was struck by an iron sailing vessel. It killed 226 people, including all 4 of Spafford's daughters. His wife Anna survived, and sent a telegram to Stanford that read, "Saved alone." As Spafford traveled on a different boat to meet her in England, the captain told him the point where his children had died, and that's when he started writing the hymn. With faith, God can use tragedies to give all of us hope. I realize that this message is near the end of the year, and I hope that you got something out of it that you can carry into the new year. Do you have the faith that's intertwined with your salvation? Do you have the faith to remove the mountains or challenges that you face? Do you have the faith to trust God when times are difficult? Do you have the faith to trust God to provide what you need and share it with others? Do you have the faith of a child, content to let God guide you? Do you have the faith to know if when you're gone, there'll be a celebration and not a funeral? Do you have no faith, little faith, or great faith? Thank you.